My corrupt ex-sergeant ordered my wife kidnapped to protect his embezzlement scheme. The killers took my wife's life before I could pay the ransom. They thought a grieving husband would stay silent. At 3 a.m. that night, I surprised them. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. My name is Vincent and I'm 58 years old. 3 months ago, I lost the only woman who ever truly understood me. Her name was Kelly, and she didn't just die, she was murdered. The worst part? I know exactly who ordered it and why. It was a Tuesday morning in September when everything changed. Kelly had been making her famous blueberry pancakes, humming that old song she loved, while the coffee brewed. After 32 years of marriage, I still got butterflies watching her move around our kitchen. She had this way of making even the most ordinary moments feel special. "You're staring again," she said without turning around, that smile already in her voice. "Can't help it," I replied, reaching for my coffee. "Still can't believe you married an old soldier like me." She turned then, flour dusting her cheek, and gave me that look that made me feel like I was 25 again. "You're not that old, Vincent, and you're my soldier." Those were the last normal words we ever exchanged. My phone rang at exactly 7:43 that morning. Unknown number. Kelly glanced at me, eyebrow raised. We both knew I rarely got calls that early. Something cold settled in my stomach as I answered. "Vincent Morrison?" The voice was distorted, electronically altered. "Who is this?" "We have your wife." The world stopped. I looked at Kelly, still standing by the stove, pancake batter on the spatula in her hand. She was right there, safe, making breakfast. But the voice continued. "If you want to see her alive again, you'll listen very carefully. No police. No heroes, just money." "Wait, that's impossible. My wife is right here." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, confused, when Kelly's expression changed. She was looking past me, toward the front door. I turned and saw shadows moving outside our living room window. "Vincent?" Kelly's voice was barely a whisper. The front door exploded inward. 3 men in dark clothing and ski masks rushed in. I lunged forward, but one of them already had Kelly, a cloth pressed to her face. Her eyes went wide, then rolled back as whatever was on that cloth took effect. "Kelly!" I started toward them, but the barrel of a gun pressed against my temple stopped me cold. "Easy, soldier boy," one of them said. His voice had a familiar accent, something that tickled the back of my memory. "You know the drill. We'll be in touch." They carried Kelly out like she weighed nothing. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes. I stood in my destroyed doorway, watching a black van disappear down our quiet suburban street, taking my entire world with it. The phone rang again 20 minutes later. "Now, do we have your attention?" Same distorted voice. "What do you want?" $200,000. Cash. You have 72 hours. 200,000. My entire retirement savings, and then some. I need more time, that's a lot of money. 72 hours, Vincent. And remember, no police. We'll know if you involve them. The way he said my name, with that slight pause before it, made my blood run cold. This wasn't random. They knew me. I spent the next 3 days liquidating everything I could. Retirement accounts, savings bonds, even Kelly's grandmother's jewelry. I barely slept, barely ate. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart stopped. Kelly's sister called twice, wondering why Kelly hadn't returned her calls. I lied, said she was feeling under the weather. The drop was set for Friday night at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. I arrived at exactly midnight, 2 duffel bags full of cash in my trembling hands. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the concrete floor. "Leave the bags and go," a voice called from the darkness. "Not until I see my wife." "You're not in a position to negotiate, soldier." That word again. Soldier. The way he emphasized it made my skin crawl. I left the bags and drove home, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. They said they'd call within 24 hours to tell me where to find Kelly. The call never came. Instead, 2 police officers showed up at my door Sunday morning. Detective Sarah Chen, a small woman with kind eyes, and her partner, Detective Rodriguez, a bear of a man who looked like he'd seen too much. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Detective Chen. We need to speak with you about your wife." The way she said it I already knew, but I had to ask anyway. "Did you find her?" Detective Chen's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison. We found Mrs. Morrison's body early this morning. A jogger discovered her in Riverside Park." The world tilted sideways. I gripped the door frame to keep from falling. "How?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Single gunshot to the head. It appears she'd been there for several days." Several days. They'd killed her before I even paid the ransom. While I was scraping together every penny I had, begging banks for emergency withdrawals, she was already gone. Detective Rodriguez stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, we understand this is difficult, but we need to ask some questions. When did you last see your wife?" I told them everything. The phone calls, the ransom demand, the warehouse drop. They listened with professional expressions, taking notes, asking follow-up questions. But I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was just another grieving husband telling a story that didn't quite add up. "Mr. Morrison," Detective Chen said gently, "we'll investigate every lead, but I have to ask, do you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt you or your family?" My mind immediately went to Marcus. Sergeant Marcus Hartwell, my former commanding officer. The man who'd made my last 2 years in the service a living hell. The man who'd forced me into early retirement when I refused to look the other way on his questionable activities. But I couldn't tell them that. Not yet. I needed to think, needed to figure out if Marcus was really capable of something like this. "No," I lied. "No enemies that I know of." The detectives left their cards and promised to be in touch. I closed the door and stood in my empty house, surrounded by the remnants of our last breakfast together. Kelly's coffee cup still sat on the counter, lipstick stain on the rim. The pancake batter had hardened in the bowl. That night, I sat in our bedroom holding one of Kelly's sweaters, breathing in the faint scent of her perfume. The official story was that Kelly Morrison had been the victim of a random kidnapping gone wrong, but I knew better. Someone had targeted us specifically. Someone who knew my military background, knew about my savings, knew exactly how to hurt me most. And as I sat there in the dark, one name kept echoing in my head: Marcus Hartwell. The man who'd sworn to have his revenge when I'd refused to falsify those equipment reports. The man who'd looked me in the eye 2 years ago and said, "You have no idea what you've cost me, Morrison. But you will." I thought he'd meant my career, my reputation. I never imagined he'd go after Kelly. But now, holding my dead wife's sweater in my hands, I knew I'd been naive. Marcus Hartwell had taken everything from me, my career, my pride, and now, my wife. He thought a grieving widower would stay quiet, would disappear into his grief, and never cause trouble again. He thought wrong. The funeral was held on a gray Thursday morning. Kelly would have hated the weather. She always said gray skies made everything look hopeless. I stood beside her casket in my dress uniform, the same one I'd worn to countless military ceremonies, accepting condolences from neighbors and friends who had no idea their sympathy was being offered to a man planning murder. Detective Chen approached me after the service, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted to update you on the investigation." I straightened, forcing myself to look like a man desperate for answers rather than one who already knew too much. "Have you found anything?" "We're following several leads, but I have to be honest. Without more evidence, this case is challenging." He paused, studying my face. "The warehouse where you made the drop was clean. No prints, no surveillance cameras in the area. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." "Of course they did." Marcus had always been meticulous, even when we served together. Every operation planned down to the smallest detail. "What about the phone calls? Can't you trace those?" "Burner phones, probably disposed of immediately. We're working with the cell towers, but..." He shrugged. "These people were professionals." Professionals? That word hit me like a punch to the gut. Not random criminals looking for quick cash, professionals with military precision. After Detective Chen left, I drove home through streets that felt foreign now. Everything looked the same suburban houses, the same well-maintained lawns, the same illusion of safety, but I saw it all differently now. Kelly's death had pulled back a curtain, revealing a world where former sergeants could order hits on innocent women and make it look like random crime. That evening, I sat in my study, staring at a bottle of whiskey I'd opened, but couldn't bring myself to drink. Kelly had given it to me for our 30th anniversary, a bottle of single malt that cost more than her wedding ring. For special occasions, she'd said with a wink, what could be more special than planning to avenge her murder? I opened my laptop and began researching Marcus Hartwell. Social media made it almost too easy. His Facebook page was a shrine to his post-military success. Photos of him at charity golf tournaments, posing with local politicians, accepting awards from veteran organizations. The perfect image of a decorated soldier turned community leader. But I knew the real Marcus, the man who'd lost equipment shipments and blamed subordinates, the man who'd pushed through supply contracts with companies that gave him generous kickbacks, the man who'd built a second career on the foundation of military corruption. I scrolled through his photos, noting faces that appeared repeatedly. A thin man with cold eyes who showed up at several events, a woman with short blonde hair who seemed to be at every political function. These weren't random acquaintances. They were associates, maybe even accomplices. My phone rang, startling me from my research. Unknown number. Vincent Morrison. My blood turned to ice. It was the same voice from the kidnapping calls, but this time without the electronic distortion. Who is this? A friend. Someone who thinks you should know the truth about what happened to your wife. I gripped the phone tighter. What truth? Meet me tomorrow night, Riverside Park, near where they found her. Come alone. Wait. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. This could be a trap, another layer of Marcus's game. Or it could be someone with real information, someone who knew what had really happened to Kelly. I barely slept that night. Every sound in the house made me jump. The refrigerator cycling on, the heater clicking, the settling of old wood. Sounds that used to be comforting now felt ominous. I kept thinking about that voice on the phone, trying to place it. There had been something familiar about it, like an accent I'd heard before, but couldn't quite identify. The next evening, I arrived at Riverside Park 15 minutes early. The area where Kelly's body had been found was still marked with police tape, fluttering in the autumn breeze like yellow ghosts. I positioned myself behind a cluster of oak trees where I could watch the meeting spot while staying hidden. At exactly 8 o'clock, a figure emerged from the shadows near the playground. A man in his 40s, medium height, wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap, pulled low over his face. He looked around nervously before settling on a bench near the police tape. I waited another 5 minutes, watching for signs that this was an ambush. When no one else appeared, I stepped out from behind the trees and approached the bench. You called me, I said, sitting down but keeping distance between us. The man didn't look at me directly. My name is Eddie Vasquez. I used to work with Marcus Hartwell. My pulse quickened. Used to? Until I grew a conscience. He finally turned toward me, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Your wife wasn't the first, Mr. Morrison, and she won't be the last unless someone stops him. What do you mean, not the first? Eddie reached into his jacket, and I tensed, ready to run or fight. But he only pulled out a manila envelope, thick with papers. 3 years ago, a supply sergeant named David Chen started asking questions about missing equipment. 2 months later, he died in a car accident. Brake failure. Eddie's voice was flat, emotionless. Last year, a contractor named Maria Santos threatened to expose kickback schemes. She was found dead in her apartment, apparent suicide. My mouth went dry. You're saying Marcus killed them? I'm saying Marcus has people who handle problems, people who make inconvenient questions disappear. He handed me the envelope. Your wife found something, didn't she? Something that connected you to his operation? I thought back to the weeks before Kelly's death, trying to remember anything unusual. Then it hit me. The boxes in our garage. When I'd cleaned out my office after forced retirement, I'd brought home several boxes of paperwork, financial records, supply manifests, personnel files. I'd planned to go through them eventually, maybe write a book about military corruption. But life got in the way, and the boxes sat untouched in our garage. She was cleaning out the garage, I said slowly. She mentioned finding some interesting paperwork in my old files. Eddie nodded grimly. Marcus has been paranoid about those files for 2 years. He knew you had access to information that could destroy him, but as long as you stayed quiet, he left you alone. But if your wife found something specific, something that tied him directly to the corruption, the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Kelly hadn't been kidnapped for ransom money. She'd been killed to keep her quiet, and the ransom demand was just cover, a way to make it look like random crime. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Eddie was quiet for a long moment, staring at the police tape marking where my wife had died. "Because I'm tired of cleaning up his messes, because good people like your wife keep dying while he gets richer and more powerful." He stood up, pulling his cap lower, "and because someone needs to stop him before he kills again." "What's in the envelope?" "Enough to get you started, financial records, names, dates. But be careful, Mr. Morrison. Marcus has eyes everywhere, including the police department." He started to walk away, then turned back. "One more thing. The men who took your wife, they work for a private security company called Blackwater Solutions. Marcus uses them for his dirty work." As Eddie disappeared into the darkness, I sat alone on the bench, holding the envelope that might contain the key to bringing down Kelly's killer. The police tape fluttered in the wind, and for the first time since her death, I felt something other than grief. I felt rage, cold, calculated rage that settled in my chest like armor. Marcus Hartwell thought he'd silenced Kelly and intimidated me into submission. He thought a grieving widower would be too broken to fight back. He had no idea what he'd awakened. I spent the rest of that night going through Eddie's envelope with the methodical precision that 30 years of military service had beaten into me. What I found made my blood run cold. Marcus hadn't just been skimming money from equipment contracts. He'd built an entire empire of corruption that reached deep into the military supply chain, local government, and private security companies. The financial records showed payments totaling over $3 million spread across 24 shell companies. Equipment worth hundreds of thousands had been reported as lost or damaged, only to be sold on the black market. But it was the personnel file that made me understand why Kelly had to die. According to Eddie's documents, Kelly had photographed a specific page from my old files, a supply manifest from 18 months ago that showed a shipment of night vision equipment worth $80,000. The equipment had been marked as destroyed in training accident, but the manifest bore Marcus's signature approving the disposal. The problem was, Kelly had also found the corresponding insurance claim filed by Marcus personally, seeking reimbursement for the destroyed equipment. The same equipment that had actually been sold to Blackwater Solutions for $45,000. It was direct, documentable proof of fraud. With Kelly's photographs and the supporting financial records, any prosecutor could have built an airtight case against Marcus, but only if the evidence survived long enough to reach the right hands. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of understanding settling over me like a shroud. Kelly hadn't just stumbled onto random corruption. She'd found the smoking gun that could have brought down Marcus's entire operation, and for that, he'd had her murdered. My hands shook as I reached for the bottle of whiskey. This time, I didn't hesitate. The alcohol burned going down, but it was nothing compared to the fire building in my chest. The next morning, I drove to Kelly's grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone was simple black granite with her name, dates, and the inscription we'd chosen together years ago, "Beloved wife and eternal optimist." Kelly had laughed when we picked it out, saying she wanted people to remember her smile, not her death. Now, standing in the morning mist, I made her a promise. "I'm going to find them all, sweetheart, every last one of them who had a hand in this." I spent the next week playing the role of grieving widower while secretly conducting surveillance on Marcus and his associates. I followed him to his office at the Veterans Affairs Building, to his lunch meetings at expensive restaurants, to his evening visits to a warehouse complex on the industrial side of town. It was at the warehouse that I saw him for the first time since my forced retirement. Marcus Hartwell looked exactly the same. Ramrod straight posture, perfectly pressed uniform, silver hair that made him look distinguished rather than old. He was talking to the thin man from his Facebook photos, the one with cold eyes who appeared at all the political events. I sat in my car across the street using binoculars to watch their conversation. They seemed relaxed, confident. Marcus was even smiling as he handed the thin man a manila envelope, similar to the one Eddie had given me. That's when I saw the Blackwater Solutions logo on the side of the building. My phone buzzed with a text message from Eddie. "Can you meet tonight? Same place. I have more information." I arrived at Riverside Park early again, but this time I wasn't alone. 3 cars were parked in unusual positions around the park's perimeter, and I could see figures moving in the shadows near the tree line. My military training kicked in, and I recognized the setup immediately. Ambush. I was about to leave when my phone rang. Eddie's voice was strained, frightened. "Vincent, don't come to the park. They know I've been talking to you." "Where are you?" "Hiding in the restroom building. They've got the whole area surrounded." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Listen to me carefully. Marcus isn't just stealing equipment. He's been selling weapons to criminal organizations, using his position to access military arsenals." My blood turned to ice. Weapons trafficking was federal crime territory, the kind that brought life sentences. Kelly found shipping records, Eddie continued, assault rifles, ammunition, even explosives, all reported as training casualties, all sold through Blackwater to gang networks in 3 states. The scope of it was staggering. Marcus had turned military corruption into organized crime. "Eddie, how do I get you out of there?" "You don't. I'm already dead, Vincent. But I'm going to try to upload everything to a secure server before they find me. Password is Kelly's birthday, month and day, no spaces." The line went dead. I sat in my car, engine running, watching the park from a distance. 10 minutes later, I heard sirens. Police cars and an ambulance converged on the restroom building. I didn't need to wait for the news report to know what they'd found. Eddie Vasquez would be ruled a suicide, a troubled veteran who'd taken his own life in a public park. Case closed. But before they'd silenced him, Eddie had given me the password to files that could expose everything. I drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight, my knuckles went white, my mind already planning my next move. At home, I used Kelly's old laptop to access the server Eddie had mentioned. The password worked, and what I found made me sick to my stomach. Thousands of documents, purchase orders, shipping manifests, financial transfers, communications between Marcus and his network of criminals. It wasn't just weapons trafficking. They were running drugs, laundering money, even providing security services to criminal organizations. But the most damning evidence was a series of encrypted emails between Marcus and someone identified only as the Colonel. The emails discussed specific problems that needed to be handled permanently. David Chen, the supply sergeant who died in the brake failure accident. Maria Santos, the contractor who'd committed suicide. And at the bottom of the most recent email thread, Kelly's name. K. Morrison has photographs of Manifest 774. Recommend immediate action before she contacts authorities. The reply from the Colonel was brief. Approved. Make it look random. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, reading the cold, clinical language they'd used to order my wife's death. Kelly hadn't been a person to them, just another problem to be eliminated. The worst part was realizing how long they'd been watching us. The emails went back 3 weeks before Kelly's death, tracking her daily routines, noting when I was home versus when she was alone. They'd studied us like prey animals, planning the perfect moment to strike. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that killing Kelly would break me, that I'd retreat into grief and never pose a threat to their operation. Instead, they'd created their worst nightmare, a highly trained soldier with nothing left to lose and every reason to destroy them. I copied all the files to multiple secure drives, then sat back to plan my war. Marcus had his network of criminals and corrupt officials. He had money, power, and professional killers at his disposal. But I had something he'd forgotten about. I had 30 years of military training, combat experience, and the burning need to make him pay for what he'd done to Kelly. Marcus Hartwell thought he was untouchable, protected by his web of corruption and violence. He was about to learn that some enemies can't be bought, intimidated, or killed. Some enemies fight back. I spent the next 2 weeks studying my enemy with the same intensity I'd once used to plan military operations. Marcus Hartwell had a routine as predictable as clockwork: morning workouts at the Veterans Center, lunch meetings at Romano's Italian restaurant, evening visits to his warehouse operations, and weekend golf at the country club where he networked with local politicians. But it was his personal habits that revealed his weaknesses. Marcus was arrogant, believing his own mythology about being untouchable. He drove the same route home every night, parked in the same spot, and never varied his schedule. For a man running a criminal enterprise, he showed remarkably little paranoia about his own security. That would be his downfall. I began my infiltration carefully, using skills I'd learned in intelligence gathering during my military service. The first step was getting close to his inner circle without arousing suspicion. Romano's restaurant became my second home. I started eating lunch there 3 times a week, always sitting at the bar where I could observe Marcus's meetings while appearing to be just another lonely widower drowning his sorrows in pasta and wine. The staff grew accustomed to seeing me, and after 10 days, I was practically invisible. Marcus's lunch companions followed predictable patterns. Tuesdays and Thursdays, he met with a city councilman named Robert Hayes, who controlled municipal contracts. Fridays, he dined with a woman I recognized from Eddie's photos, Sarah Mitchell, who ran Blackwater Solutions and coordinated the muscle for Marcus's operations. But it was his Wednesday meetings that gave me the opening I needed. Every Wednesday at exactly 12:30, Marcus met with Father Miguel Santos, the local VA chaplain. Father Santos was Maria Santos's older brother, the contractor who'd been murdered and made to look like suicide. The priest had no idea he was having lunch with his sister's killer. I made my approach on a rainy Wednesday in November. As Father Santos left the restaurant, I followed him to the parking lot. "Excuse me, Father. I'm Vincent Morrison. I'm struggling with some things after my wife's death, and I was wondering if we could talk." Father Santos was a small, gentle man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Of course, my son. Would you like to come by the chapel later today?" "Actually, Father, there's something specific I need to tell you about your sister Maria." His expression changed immediately, pain flashing across his features. "What about Maria?" I took a deep breath, knowing I was about to destroy this man's peace, but needing his help to get justice for Kelly. "She didn't commit suicide, Father. She was murdered by the same people who killed my wife." The rain intensified as I showed him Eddie's files on my phone, explaining the connection between Maria's threat to expose the kickback schemes and her convenient death. Father Santos listened in stunned silence, his face growing paler with each revelation. "Marcus Hartwell," he whispered finally. "I've been having lunch with him for months. He told me he was trying to help find answers about Maria's death. He was making sure the investigation stayed closed," I said gently. "Father, I need your help to stop him before he kills again." Father Santos stared at the rain pooling on the asphalt, tears mixing with the water on his cheeks. When he looked up, I saw something new in his eyes, not the gentle forgiveness of a priest, but the righteous anger of a brother seeking justice. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next week, Father Santos became my inside source on Marcus's operations. During their weekly lunches, he asked carefully crafted questions about the Veterans Program funding, about equipment donations, about Marcus's various business relationships. Marcus, believing he was talking to a harmless priest, revealed details about his network that would have taken me months to uncover on my own. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd imagined. Marcus's corruption reached into the highest levels of local government. The police chief, Harold Morrison, no relation to me despite sharing a last name, was on Marcus's payroll, explaining why the investigations into David Chen's and Maria Santos's deaths had been so superficial. 2 county commissioners received regular payments for steering contracts to Marcus's shell companies. Even the district attorney's office had been compromised. The assistant DA, who'd handled Maria's case, had received a $25,000 campaign contribution from one of Marcus's front organizations just weeks before, ruling her death a suicide. But the most chilling discovery was the scope of the weapons trafficking. According to Father Santos's carefully gathered intelligence, Marcus was supplying automatic weapons to criminal organizations across the Southeast. The profits were enormous. A rifle that cost the military $800 could be sold for $5,000 on the black market. Everything was coordinated through Blackwater Solutions, which provided both the muscle for intimidation and the logistics for moving stolen weapons. Sarah Mitchell ran the operation with military precision, using former Special Forces personnel who asked no questions as long as the money kept flowing. As I gathered this intelligence, I also began preparing for the confrontation I knew was coming. Marcus might have corrupt officials and professional killers on his side, but I had advantages too. 30 years of military training, including 2 tours in Iraq where I'd learned urban combat tactics. More importantly, I had nothing left to lose. I started with physical preparation, returning to the workout routine I'd maintained during my active duty years. Push-ups, sit-ups, running 5 miles every morning before dawn. My body wasn't 25 anymore, but it remembered the disciplines that had kept me alive in combat zones. Next came equipment acquisition. I couldn't exactly walk into a gun store and buy assault weapons, but I didn't need to. My military service had taught me how to improvise, how to turn everyday items into deadly tools. A trip to the hardware store provided everything I needed to create diversions, disable vehicles, and neutralize threats. But the most important part of my preparation was psychological. I spent hours each night sitting in Kelly's chair, holding her photograph, letting the rage build inside me like a slow-burning fire. Marcus had taken everything that mattered to me, destroyed the life we'd built together, silenced her voice forever. He thought he'd broken me, turned me into just another grieving victim who'd fade into insignificance. Instead, he'd forged me into something dangerous, a weapon with a single purpose. By the first week of December, I was ready. Father Santos had provided me with Marcus's complete schedule, including his weekend routine at the country club, where security was minimal and exits were numerous. Sarah Mitchell's daily patterns were mapped, her home address confirmed, her personal security habits assessed. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would take them at the moment they felt most secure, most untouchable. Marcus during his private Saturday morning workout at the Veterans Center when the building was nearly empty. Sarah Mitchell at her isolated farmhouse outside town, where she conducted her most sensitive business away from prying eyes. I would give them the same chance they'd given Kelly, none at all. But first, I had one more visit to make. On Friday evening, I drove to Riverside Park and sat on the bench where Eddie Vasquez had risked his life to give me the truth. The police tape was gone now. The area returned to normal as if nothing tragic had ever happened there. I pulled out my phone and called Detective Chen. "Detective, this is Vincent Morrison. I have some information about my wife's murder." "Mr. Morrison, if you've remembered something new—" "I remember everything now," I interrupted. "And tomorrow morning, you're going to have a lot of new cases to investigate." I hung up before she could respond and deleted her number from my phone. Tomorrow, the truth about Marcus Hartwell's criminal empire would be exposed, but not through the corrupt legal system he'd spent years compromising. Tomorrow, justice would be delivered by a widowed soldier who'd run out of patience with official channels. Marcus Hartwell had scheduled his own reckoning, and he didn't even know it. 3 o'clock in the morning. The world belongs to insomniacs, shift workers, and men seeking justice in the darkness. I sat in my car across from Sarah Mitchell's farmhouse, watching the single light burning in her home office window. According to Father Santos's intelligence, she conducted her most sensitive business from this isolated location, coordinating weapon shipments and planning the elimination of problems like my wife. Tonight, she would discover what it felt like to be hunted. I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, studying the property during daylight hours while disguised as a lost driver, asking for directions. The farmhouse sat on 15 acres of rolling hills, accessible by a single gravel road that wound through dense woods. No neighbors within shouting distance, no security cameras that I could detect, And most importantly, no escape routes except the way you came in. Sarah had chosen the perfect location for conducting criminal business. She'd also chosen the perfect place to die. I checked my equipment one final time. Night vision goggles from my military days, still functional after all these years. A tactical vest under my dark clothing, zip ties for restraints, and Kelly's camera, the same one she'd used to photograph the evidence that got her killed. Tonight, it would document Sarah's confession. The house was a modest two-story structure with white siding and green shutters, trying to project the image of rural innocence. But the reinforced windows and steel core doors revealed its true purpose. This wasn't a home. It was a fortress designed to keep secrets and eliminate witnesses. I approached through the tree line, moving with the silent precision that had kept me alive in urban combat zones. The ground was soft from recent rain, muffling my footsteps as I circled the property. Two vehicles sat in the driveway, Sarah's black Mercedes and a pickup truck I didn't recognize. That meant she wasn't alone. Through the office window, I could see Sarah hunched over a computer, her short blonde hair reflecting the monitor's glow. But there was movement in the kitchen. A large man in tactical gear, probably one of her Blackwater operatives. I'd planned for this contingency. Multiple targets required a different approach, one that eliminated the security first while keeping Sarah alive long enough to confess. The power line feeding the house ran through the woods, easily accessible and completely unguarded. A few snips with wire cutters, and the farmhouse plunged into darkness. I heard Sarah's voice through the open window, sharp with irritation. "What the hell? Check the breaker box." Heavy footsteps moved toward the back of the house. The security operative would go outside to investigate, separating himself from his principal. Classic mistake. Never leave your protectee alone during a potential threat. I positioned myself beside the back door, pressed against the wall where the emerging guard wouldn't see me until it was too late. The door opened, and a man stepped out carrying a flashlight and what looked like a Glock pistol. He was big, probably 6'4", and built like a linebacker, but size doesn't matter when you have the element of surprise. I struck the pressure point behind his ear with surgical precision, a technique I'd learned from Special Forces instructors. He dropped like a felled tree, unconscious before he hit the ground. I zip-tied his hands and feet, then dragged him into the woods where he wouldn't be found until morning. His pistol went into my waistband as backup. Now, for Sarah. I entered through the back door, moving through the dark house with my night vision goggles, turning everything into green-tinted clarity. Sarah was still in her office, now using her phone's flashlight to illuminate her computer screen. She was trying to save files to a portable drive, probably destroying evidence in case this power outage was more than coincidence. Too late for that. "Hello, Sarah." She spun around, the phone's light creating a stark circle of illumination in the dark room. When she saw me standing in her doorway, her face went through a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, recognition, and finally, fear. "Vincent Morrison." Her voice was steady, but I could see her hand slowly reaching for something beneath her desk. "I wondered when you'd show up." "Keep your hands where I can see them." She froze, calculating her options. Sarah Mitchell was a professional, a former military officer who'd built a criminal empire through careful planning and ruthless execution. But she'd never faced a man with nothing left to lose. "You killed my wife," I said, stepping into the room but staying near the doorway. "You had her murdered to protect Marcus's operation." Sarah's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Then let me refresh your memory." I pulled out Kelly's camera and activated the video function, the small red light, providing the only illumination in the room. 3 weeks before Kelly's death, you received an email from Marcus about photographs she'd taken. Your response was to recommend immediate action. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. "How did you—" "Eddie Vasquez gave me everything before you had him killed too." I kept the camera trained on her face. "Just like David Chen and Maria Santos, how many people have you murdered to protect this operation?" Sarah laughed, a cold sound in the darkness. "You think you're some kind of hero? Your wife stuck her nose where it didn't belong? In my world, that has consequences." "Tell me about those consequences." She leaned back in her chair, suddenly relaxed. The professional killer's arrogance was taking over, the belief that she could still control the situation. Kelly Morrison photographed evidence that could have destroyed a very profitable enterprise. We gave her a chance to forget what she'd seen, but she was planning to contact the authorities. Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, discussing murder like a business transaction. So we arranged a permanent solution. You kidnapped her for ransom to make it look random. Marcus's idea. He thought it would be poetic justice, making you pay for your wife's curiosity before we killed her anyway. Sarah's smile was predatory. The look on your face when you realized you'd paid $200,000 for nothing, that was worth it all. The rage that had been building in my chest for months finally broke free. This woman had orchestrated Kelly's murder, not just for money, but for the sadistic pleasure of watching me suffer. She'd turned my wife's death into entertainment. Who pulled the trigger? My voice was barely a whisper. Does it matter? Dead is dead, Vincent. Your wife is gone and you're about to join her. She was stalling, I realized. The hand that had been reaching for something under her desk was now pressing against what looked like a panic button. Backup was coming. You're right about one thing, I said, moving closer to her desk. Dead is dead. Sarah's confidence faltered as she realized her backup wasn't coming. The man she'd sent to check the power was zip-tied in the woods, and her panic button was useless without electricity to transmit the signal. For the first time in our conversation, she looked genuinely afraid. What do you want from me? The truth, all of it, on camera. I spent the next 20 minutes filming Sarah Mitchell's complete confession. The weapons trafficking operation, the bribery of local officials, the murders of David Chen, Maria Santos, Eddie Vasquez, and Kelly. She detailed Marcus's role as the operation's mastermind, the financial structure of their criminal enterprise, and the names of every corrupt official who'd enabled their activities. She talked to save her life, not realizing that her confession was also her death warrant. There, she said finally, you have everything. Now what? I considered my options. Sarah Mitchell was a cold-blooded killer who'd orchestrated my wife's murder. She deserved to die, and no court in the world would convict me for giving her what she'd given Kelly. But killing her wouldn't bring Kelly back. It would just make me a murderer too. Instead, I zip-tied her hands and feet, then used her own phone to call 911. I need to report a break-in and assault, I said when the dispatcher answered. The perpetrator is restrained and waiting for police at... I gave them the address. Sarah stared at me in disbelief. You're just going to turn me over to the police? Half of them are on Marcus's payroll. Not all of them, I said, uploading her confession video to multiple secure servers. And by morning, every news outlet in the state will have copies of your confession. I left Sarah zip-tied in her office and walked back through the dark house, emerging into the pre-dawn darkness with a sense of completion. One down, one to go. Marcus Hartwell was next, and unlike Sarah, he wouldn't get the chance to confess. He would get exactly what he'd given Kelly: no mercy, no second chances, and no way out. By 6:30 in the morning, Sarah Mitchell's confession was already spreading across the internet like wildfire. I'd sent copies to every major news outlet, the FBI field office, the state attorney general, and 3 different corruption watchdog organizations. Within hours, Marcus Hartwell's criminal empire would be front-page news across the Southeast. But I wanted to see his face when his world collapsed. Marcus maintained his Saturday morning routine with religious precision. Every weekend at exactly 7 o'clock, he arrived at the Veterans Center for a private workout in the facility's basement gym. The building would be nearly empty. Just Marcus, maybe a security guard, and me. I parked across the street and watched him pull up in his silver Cadillac, looking every inch the distinguished veteran and community leader. He wore a pressed tracksuit and carried a leather gym bag, projecting an image of disciplined success. In a few hours, he'd be wearing handcuffs. I waited 10 minutes before following him inside. The security guard at the front desk was reading a newspaper, barely glancing up as I signed the visitor log with a fake name. My military ID still granted me access to veteran facilities, one of the few benefits I'd retained from my service. The basement gym was exactly as I remembered from my own visits years ago. Weight machines, free weights, and a small boxing area where soldiers worked out their frustrations on heavy bags. Marcus was alone, running on a treadmill with his back to the door, earbuds in, completely focused on his workout. He had no idea his life was about to end. I approached quietly, my footsteps masked by the treadmill's mechanical hum. When I was close enough to touch him, I reached over and hit the emergency stop button. Marcus stumbled as the belt jerked to a halt, pulling out his earbuds and spinning around with an expression of annoyance that quickly changed to shock when he saw who had interrupted his workout. Vincent Morrison. His voice was steady, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. "I heard about your wife. Tragic loss. Was it tragic, Marcus, or was it just business?" He stepped off the treadmill, reaching for a towel to wipe his face. The movement was casual, but I noticed how he positioned himself near the weight rack where a 45-pound plate could become a weapon. "I don't know what you're implying, but I think grief might be affecting your judgment." Sarah Mitchell disagrees. Marcus went very still. "I don't know who that is." "Sure you do. She runs Blackwater Solutions, coordinates your weapons trafficking operation, and last night she gave a very detailed confession about how you ordered my wife's murder." The mask of concerned sympathy finally slipped from Marcus's face, revealing the cold predator underneath. "You always were too smart for your own good, Morrison. That's why I had to force you out. Because I wouldn't help you steal from the military. Because you were a self-righteous fool who didn't understand how the real world works." Marcus's voice was harsh now, all pretense abandoned. "You think the military cares about missing equipment? You think anyone gives a damn about a few weapons sold to fund real operations? Real operations? You mean lining your own pockets?" Marcus laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "I spent 35 years serving this country, watching politicians cut our budgets while expecting us to work miracles. So I found alternative funding sources. By selling weapons to criminals. By being practical. The guns were going to end up on the black market anyway, at least this way. Patriots got paid instead of foreign arms dealers." I stared at him, amazed by his ability to rationalize mass murder as patriotism. "And Kelly was killing her patriotic too?" Marcus's expression hardened. "Your wife should have minded her own business. When she started photographing classified documents, she became a security threat. She was an innocent woman cleaning out our garage. There are no innocent civilians in war, Morrison. You should know that better than anyone." The casual way he dismissed Kelly's life, the complete absence of remorse or recognition that he'd destroyed something beautiful and irreplaceable, finally broke the last restraint on my rage. "You want to talk about war?" I said, moving closer. "Let's talk about war." Marcus reached for the weight plate, but 30 years of military training had taught me to anticipate threats. I caught his wrist before he could lift the 45-pound disc, applying pressure to the nerve cluster that would paralyze his hand. He gasped in pain, dropping the weight with a crash that echoed through the empty gym. "Kelly took photographs of Manifest 774, I said, maintaining pressure on his wrist. "The night vision equipment you reported destroyed, but actually sold to Blackwater. She was going to turn it over to the authorities." "More. So we eliminated the threat," Marcus gasped. "Standard operational procedure. Standard procedure." I released his wrist and stepped back, disgusted. "You murdered my wife to cover up petty theft." Marcus rubbed his injured hand, his eyes filled with hatred. "Petty theft? We moved over $50 million worth of equipment in 2 years. This wasn't some soldier stealing MREs. This was a sophisticated redistribution operation." "Redistribution?" I laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call arming drug dealers and gang members? I call it free market capitalism. The weapons existed, there was demand, we provided supply. Economics 101. I realized then that Marcus would never understand what he'd done wrong. In his mind, Kelly's murder was just another business decision, a necessary cost of maintaining profitable operations. He felt no guilt, no remorse, no recognition that he destroyed innocent lives for money. That made what I had to do easier. "There's something you should know," I said, pulling out my phone. "Sarah's confession has been sent to every news outlet in the Southeast. By now, the FBI is probably raiding your warehouse." Marcus's face went pale. "You're bluffing." I showed him the screen where news alerts were already appearing. Corruption scandal rocks military veterans' affairs. Former sergeant accused of weapons trafficking. Murder for hire plot exposed by widow's investigation. His empire was collapsing in real time. "You destroyed everything," Marcus whispered, staring at the headlines. "No, Marcus, you destroyed everything the day you decided Kelly had to die. I could have killed him then. It would have been easy. A quick strike to his throat, a fall down the concrete stairs, any number of accidents that could befall a man working out alone. Marcus Hartwell deserved to die for what he'd done to Kelly, to David Chen, to Maria Santos, to Eddie Vasquez. But killing him wouldn't bring Kelly back. And unlike Marcus, I wasn't willing to become a murderer to get what I wanted. Instead, I called Detective Chen. "Detective, this is Vincent Morrison. I'm at the Veterans Center basement gym with Marcus Hartwell. You'll want to arrest him before he tries to run." Marcus made one last desperate play, lunging for a barbell to use as a weapon. But he was 62 years old, out of shape despite his regular workouts, and facing a man who'd spent 30 years learning how to neutralize threats. I put him on the ground with minimal effort, using a restraint hold that kept him immobilized without causing permanent damage. He lay there, gasping, his face pressed against the cold concrete, finally understanding what it felt like to be powerless. "Kelly was the best person I ever knew," I said quietly. "She made the world better just by being in it, and you killed her for money." Detective Chen arrived 15 minutes later with a team of federal agents. Marcus Hartwell was arrested on charges of conspiracy, weapons trafficking, murder for hire, and about a dozen other federal crimes that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked back at me one last time. "This won't bring her back, Morrison." "No," I agreed. But it stops you from taking anyone else's wife." The trials took 8 months. Sarah Mitchell, facing the death penalty, cooperated fully with federal prosecutors in exchange for life in prison. Marcus Hartwell maintained his innocence until the end, but the evidence was overwhelming. He received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. 14 other conspirators, including Police Chief Harold Morrison, and 2 county commissioners, received prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. The corruption network that had seemed so untouchable crumbled under the weight of documented evidence and recorded confessions. I testified at every trial, telling Kelly's story to packed courtrooms and national media. Not for revenge or vindication, but so people would remember that behind every corruption scandal are real victims, innocent people whose lives are destroyed by others' greed. Today, I'm 60 years old, living in a small house by a lake 2 hours north of where Kelly and I built our life together. I keep her photograph on the mantle, along with the folded flag from my military service and a letter from the FBI thanking me for my assistance in exposing the weapons trafficking network. I visit Kelly's grave every month, bringing fresh flowers and telling her about the lives that have been saved by bringing down Marcus's operation. The weapons pipeline he created has been shut down. The corrupt officials he bought have been removed from power, and the families of his other victims finally have justice. It doesn't bring Kelly back. Nothing will ever do that. But it means her death wasn't meaningless, that the evidence she died protecting ultimately served its purpose. Sometimes, late at night, I sit on my porch watching the stars reflect on the lake's surface, and I can almost hear Kelly's voice on the wind. She would have been proud of what we accomplished together, her courage in documenting the truth, my determination to see justice done. Marcus Hartwell thought a grieving widower would be too broken to fight back. He thought wrong. Kelly's love gave me the strength to become something I'd never been before, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. In the end, that made all the difference.